Hello everyone, it's Leah from Dime Culture. Today I'll be showing you different watercolor techniques for beginners. It's always a little scary to start a new creative medium, and watercolor kinda has a bad rap for being the most difficult one to master. Truth is, not one medium can truly fully be mastered, but there are some things to know to make sure that you don't get lost on your creative art journey and become discouraged. What I'll be doing today is showing you different ways that you can use those techniques and just showing you the basics of them so that you can go out and practice them yourselves. So let's get started. Wet on wet is the most commonly known watercolor technique because, hello, watercolors need water. Ergo, you must always paint on top of water. Yeah, no, not always, but this is definitely how you go about doing it for those moments when you want to get flow. First, you lay down your water. Now, when you are laying down your water, the trick to seeing where the water is going is to have your light on it. You want to have the light on a slight angle so that you see some reflection. Then grab your paintbrush with a nicely fresh, wet bit of paint on it and brush it down, or dab it, or flick it, however you wish to get the paint on the paper. This technique is best used in one of two ways. First, when you want to create a solid color wash. A solid color wash is when you see one color with no streaks or blotchy sections. By putting down a layer of water first, you are able to ensure that the color will spread evenly over the area you wish to paint. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself here. I will be discussing this more later. Second is when you want to have a more loose color flow. So when you want to see the colors do their own creative thing and mix and intertwine with one another. And again, I will discuss this later on a little bit more. I'm also going to let you guys know at this point in time that if you do ever want to refer back to the visuals here that I'm painting, there will be a link to a blog post of this video with the photos more visibly available. Now, let's go on to the next technique. Wet on dry is a water technique that is, I think it is the most used technique, and oftentimes we forget that it is a technique that should be practiced. Wet on dry is when you take your nicely wet paintbrush and just start painting on your paper without pre-prepping with water like you do in the wet on wet. So basically, it's painting. Why this technique should be practiced is because of the color consistency. As your brush moves and your paint spreads, you most likely want to have a consistent color. But as the paint spreads, the color fades. We practice this technique to get to know our brush's ability to hold water, our paper's ability to absorb water, and to see how long it takes for the paint to fade. Plus, working on this will help with when we want to figure out layering and when we want to know when's the best time to dab in for more paint as we're painting. So practicing this technique is really helpful for when we're actually in the process of painting a painting. Now, let's move on to the next technique. Dry on dry, a technique that most beginners don't know to try or use. I know when I first got into watercolor, I would never have thought to try this. Dry on dry is when you take fresh paint from the tube and don't water it down. You just start to use the paint. This isn't the most commonly used technique, but it is a good one when you want to add some texture and when you're first getting started. If you don't have tube paint, that is okay. You can definitely create this with paint from a pan. If you're wondering what's the difference between tube paint and pan paint, I've created a video already and I explain it in greater detail. So what I'm going to do is leave a link in the description below and a pop-up on the screen. So you should see it popping up any moment now. Now, how to create this texture with pan paint. It's very easy. It may take some practice, but super simple. All you need to do is lightly add some water. And I do mean lightly add water to your brush. You don't want a lot to mix in with the paint. You want it to be sort of a dry, pasty consistency of paint on your paintbrush in order to get that dry texture look. Out of all the techniques, if you want to use this one for adding texture, I definitely suggest, if you are a pan paint user, to practice this one frequently because it is a tricky one to master. Even I myself sometimes add too much water and have to start again. What's nice about this technique is the texture it creates. You're able to see the paint that is beneath it, but also add in darker tones on top of it for, well, texture. It could be used when you're doing animal fur or human hair, anything where you want to have two-tone effects. Now, let's move on to the next one. Wet on wet color mixing. Let's get more into that wet on wet detailing I was hinting at earlier. As I was beginning to discuss a few moments ago, wet on wet is best used for those two instances, color washes and loose color flow. But what if you don't want one solid color? What if you want more colors? What if you want to blend and create several colors? The way you go about it is the same as if you were to paint one solid color. You will first lay down your water. This is when it starts to get tricky for beginners. Heck, it can still be tricky for those of us who have been doing water for quite a while. When you lay down your water, there's a large chance that you may use too much water. This is what I did here on purpose because I wanted to show you what will happen if you use too much water. And I'll show you also how to do it properly just after this one gets finished. If too much water is used, and you want to be blending colors or laying down any kind of color, you are going to start to notice that the paint itself will start to pool at the edges of the paint where the water was. It will kind of overflow a bit and collect in one spot, and it might buckle your paper. It will definitely create uneven color mixing when you're actually mixing them. And your edges will become darker than the center of your painted area. Having too much water can also make blending slightly difficult. As you can see, the water is pulling and pooling in areas that I'm not really wanting it to go. You would think that having a lot of water would definitely help with blending the colors. The difficulty part with that is that when it starts to blend, you're now creating so much color that it does pool. As you can see here, the edges are darker. Now, if you just wanted to have one color at the top of the paper and one color at the bottom and have them do that magical flow bending that watercolor is so greatly known for, the more water is better than the less water. However, like I've said, if you use too much water, you'll have the same pooling effects. Look at what's happening right now. You can see the water just moving the paint as I move the paper. This not always a good thing. So let me show you right now how you do it properly. So you're going to lay down a light layer of water, and you're going to make sure that water is evenly spread. Having the light, and I really honestly believe, having a light source on a slight angle, you can sit near a window or have a lamp on, having it so that the angle of the water, the light, and you is really key to knowing your water control in this area of the wet on wet techniques when painting. And when you are doing it with a blending, here is the key trick I have learned while on my watercolor journey. First, start out light. So you want to have a light wash of color and slowly build upon it as you're layering. So as you can see right now, the colors are blending smoothly, seamlessly. There's not too much water. I'm not having any pillowing at the edges of the paper. And now that I'm bringing in a more darker pigmented brush stroke by adding more paint to my brush, I am now able to have the paint begin to blend as it's already been blended. It'll make the smooth effect much smoother. When it comes to practicing watercolor techniques like this one here, if you do end up finding that you are getting some pooling of water, clean off your brush, dry it out, and dab it down on the edges. It'll help with reducing the amount of water and not create too much of a blotchy look. And it's definitely something that you want to practice before you sit down to paint your masterpiece painting. Also, while practicing this technique, if you have different paint types or brands, it's going to be a good idea to mix them, see how those colors flow within one another. QoR paint, I'm really learning, is a paint that is a heavy flower, and that's a good thing. I like it because I like the way it flows. Some people might not like the way it flows. Anyways, I like how it flows. So definitely try out your paints and practice with your different colors and your different brands if you have different brands. Now, let's move on to the next one. Wet on dry color blending. Wet on dry watercolor blending. Well, you may say, why blend this way when I could just use all of my colors and paint them right next to one another to mimic a color blend? And you could do this, but by just laying your colors down next to one another, you may not achieve the look you're going for. And if that look you would like to achieve is a seamless color blend like a rainbow, but you want to avoid the wet on wet approach, this is how you'd go about it. Now, when I first started playing with watercolor, I found this way of blending the wet on dry to have more control for me. I was able to restrict how much water I was using and was able to produce vibrant color blends. That's why I'm a huge fan of using this method. The outcomes are more predictable versus the possible unknown of the wet on wet water flow. As you venture further into your watercolor travels of learning, you need to master both approaches in order for you to create those magical ideas that have been forming in your mind that I am 100% positive and believe on. I have found that the key, though, to a consistent blend with the wet on dry technique is when you have your two colors on opposite sides. So you take one color on one end of the area you want to paint and your secondary color on the other side of it. And you blend one up and you blend the other down and you just go up and down. This way they blend smooth and seamless, as you can see in the display right in front of you. One thing I do want to say about this approach that I do from the up and down, is that depending on the pigment's strength of the paint that you're using, you want to be a little careful. If one pigment is stronger than the other, you'll want to reduce how high that strong pigment goes versus your other color. All right, let's get to the next one. Wet on dry color layering is really something called glazing. Personally, I like to call it layering because I am laying down a new layer of paint. You can call it whatever you'd like to call it. What's so great about watercolors are their ability to layer, and that is what attracted me to it, and it may be something that attracted you to watercolors as well. When you use other mediums on top of one another in a layering way, your previous layer is often covered completely, where with watercolors it is still visible beneath. By glazing, aka layering, which from here on out I'm just going to call it layering, okay everyone? Hope that's okay. Okay. By layering, you are creating dimension. You can even layer to create colors that are more dynamic with a blending effect. This technique practice, now it's not a technique itself in how to do something, more like a practice of a technique to learn colors. Let me try to clarify that a little bit better. So this technique of glazing isn't something that you practice and do to get used to moving your hand a certain way or to get your mind adjusted to how much water and the flow of water. It is so that you can learn your colors and how they work together. Each color layers differently, and even if you are layering the same colors, you may not get the same look in the end depending on which color is on top of the other. One thing that I really like about practicing this method is that I really get to know the paints that I'm using and how they're blending. Because see, some paints blend and layer really well, and you can layer them with many layers without them getting clouded or muddy. And there are some companies with their paints, depending on how they're made, that don't allow you to do much glazing / layering. If you are ever having a day where you just feel like painting but you can't think of something to paint, all I want you to do is grab your paints, some paper, and just work on your layering effects. See how many colors you can layer, see how your colors layer on top of one another. And really just do this so that you can practice and create, so that way when you are in the process of creating something that you really want to hang on the wall, you will already know which colors are safe for you to layer on top of one another. All right, on to the next one. The next and last one we will be discussing today is layering with wet on wet. Now, is it even possible to do a layering effect with the wet on wet style of watercolor techniques? Short answer is no. Long answer, however, is a yes. And yes, okay, I'm aware that sounds weird. How can the short answer be a no, but the long answer be a yes? Let me explain. As I said earlier in the glazing section, which I just previously showed you, is that I use the term layering to replace the term glazing because really, let's be honest, we're just layering colors. However, if you layer a wet layer of watercolor paint on top of a wet layer of watercolor paint, yes, realize I repeated right there. It is more like removing the paint you just put down or mixing the two colors. However, there are workarounds, and let me explain. The first one I'm going to discuss, I'm not showing you because it is very much like something that you've seen already. And that is taking a layer of paint, letting it dry completely, laying down your water, and then painting on top of it. So it is very much just like glazing, only now you're adding on that secondary layer of water before you put on your next layer of color, which is the one where you get that flow and the water can go off and do its own magical thing. And the one I'm showing you right now, which is the second way that you can do a wet on wet layering technique, is not a technical technique in the tradition of watercolor painting. It is, however, a way that colors can layer upon each other with their own ways. So watercolor has flow. It intertwines and mixes and works all on its own without us having to do things when water is added. This is where you're going to let the pigments do their own thing. Some pigments themselves are heavier than others, so that color will go to the bottom where another color might rise to the top. This technique of layering is I just keep saying it is letting the water do its own thing, and that is magic. Like honestly, this will create some creatively different effects. Instead of you telling it what to do, it's telling you what it wants to do. Okay, now before the video ends, I want to say thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any questions, do not hesitate at all. I will do my best to get back to you as soon as possible, so leave your questions in the comment section below. If you do want to see the visuals of this video up close and personal, I am again leaving that link in the description below so you can refer back to it and look at them a little up close and more personal. And if you like this video, which I really hope you do, and you found it really informative, please give it a thumbs up. And if, because I keep saying and if you want to get some more creative magic into your daily life, please subscribe to Dime Culture. I post new videos every Thursday. And until next time, everyone, please stay magical.